So when it comes to monogamy, I loved your comparison in one of your blogs. You were saying that people enter marriage essentially with the same like naivety of a college student signing up for an immense amount of debt, and if you don't accept the that monogamy is the only way to have a fulfilling, loving relationship, you're gonna end up alone. Like you can't have anything other than that. And I think that was pretty spot on. And you also did a thread where you were explaining, I think it was maybe polyamory, and you were saying, well, a lot of the concern from women would be that he's going to leave you and he's going to fall more in love with this person. And you were saying, well, if I love this person and he maybe has a deeper, more meaningful connection with someone else, and I try to prevent him from that, like that feels gross. And I was like, she's putting into words something I have never really been able to articulate quite as well, because my husband and I have like a different relationship. It's not fully open, but it's just our own little concoction. Like we've spent a lot of time curating exactly what works for us and our boundaries for each other. And I don't think enough people do that with their relationship. They just say, this is the relationship that I'm supposed to have. These are the rules that society says are the only rules, and till death do us part. And then you see the statistics of 50% divorce rate. So clearly something's not happening. So do you think that monogamy is going to be the standard for the rest of like our lifetimes? Do you see that starting to shift with like the younger generations? Do you think it's even attainable for people that meet and get married at a young age? What's your opinion?
Yeah, I think likely we're going to see it as a standard for most of our adult life. I think likely, if I had to make a guess, it would be that we'll see something similar happen with polyamory as we did with the gay rights movement back in the day, because there's a lot of similarities between the two. And it's going to become like a solid, accepted, and minority status, if you will. Like some people just be poly people, and that's it. Um, but yeah, you're absolutely right in that like monogamy is just a default. People don't really have this option. And like a lot of people do a lot of negotiation when they get into a relationship. They want to find somebody who's a dog person or a cat person or wants kids or something. And there's no question about like what kind of relationship style do we really want, because people don't even know how to ask themselves that question. People like don't like I'm 100%
Mm.
total poly. And I realized in hindsight that this is the way I was operating even before I knew what polyamory was. But I still like expected a monogamous relationship, and I didn't know that that was a question I could even address, even begin to start thinking of, until I had somebody else like present that as a viable option for me. And I think it's pretty similar with homosexuality. Like a lot of people, I remember going to South Korea and they told me they didn't have gay people there. And I was like, what do you mean you don't have gay people? And I think it's probably because it's just not an option. Like people don't talk about it. They suppress it. If you have those feelings, it's like kind of weird. And you convince yourself that you must be attracted to like the correct kind of person. And I think the same thing is happening. Like we have this big social rewiring that causes us to reinterpret a whole bunch of signals as evidence of monogamy to the extent that we don't even doubt it. So yeah, I think that like we should get to the point where it becomes something where people can openly question, kind of like homosexuality, and like, hey, you poly, that's cool. Are you like half poly? Do you want like kind of an open thing? Like figure out exactly like the kind of concoction that works for you. But as we get to the point that I think this is a question that people are allowed to ask themselves more, I think we're going to see a lot more happy relationships.
Mm-hmm. So, do you have any advice for people bringing this conversation up to their partner? Because I know for a lot of people I've spoken with, like it's very intimidating. They don't even know how to approach the subject. I think once they figure out what they think they want, how do they say that to their partner without telling their partner, like, you're not enough? Because it's not what it is. It's, to me, it's just the most realistic way of saying, till death do us part. It's me saying, I want to be 120 years old with you on a rocking chair, no matter what. And like my sex drive is higher than a lot of women, and I'm attracted to very nice things. And I don't want to necessarily give that part of myself up. And then I know my husband's very similar, and I don't want to put him in a situation where if he decides to partake with somebody else or share an experience with someone else, and I blow up our family, like that doesn't make sense to me either. So to me, it's almost like if it's not if it can't survive these things, these trials and tribulations, like an affair in some cases, or whatever the case may be, then it probably wasn't love to begin with. I know that's going to probably like ruffle some feathers, but
It's a
to me, love
spicy
is
take. I
like
like it.
it's unconditional. So spicy.
Yeah, I mean that's true. So many people consider uh, sleeping with somebody else to be sort of an indication that they don't want that relationship anymore, like the original one. Uh, it just seems
Mm-hmm.
so strange to me. It's like a crazy thing to try and wrap my head around. Like, okay, wait, you experienced sexual attraction to someone else, you acted on it, and that somehow means that you don't want your other. I don't get that at all. But you're right. The conversation is super
Mm-hmm.
hard to have with your partner. Um, I think that people who I did a study on or survey on monogamy versus polyamory satisfaction in relationships, and people who are either extremely monogamous or extremely polyamorous had the highest satisfaction rates. And so my theory about this is that the people who are halfway in between had the lowest satisfaction, and this occurs when people are in a monogamous relationship and one of them wants to be like, "Hey, honey, how about we try this thing?" And then they kind of try it. And so they're not totally on board, both of them. Or they're using it to try to save a dying relationship. So I think one of the hardest positions to be in is
Mm-hmm.
where you want to have an open relationship and your partner doesn't. I think it's extremely rare that that actually works out. The thing that you have to do is like actually let your partner know that this urge does not reflect on them, which is so hard. It takes a lot of like maturity on their part to be able to
Mm-hmm.
understand that. Um, and it can be like really slow going. So I'm sorry to be so pessimistic about it, but it's tough.
It's really difficult. And for me, it's odd that in our society, if you have multiple children, it's expected that there's enough love for them. You don't love one of them more. Having a second child doesn't take away love from the first child. Why is there an abundance of love for our children and our family members and our social circles, like friends, but there's not an abundance of love romantically?
Yeah, I have a friend who's a sex worker who had just had her second child. And she said something like before she had the kid, it's like she had trouble imagining how she could love another child as much as the first one. And then after she had the second one, she told me, she's like, I think I might understand polyamory now. Like, I don't know how, but I somehow love both of them so much. Like, I don't love the first child any less. And I was like, that felt so good to hear because it feels so true. Like, every time I've been in a relationship with more than one person, I'm not saying that there aren't dynamics that float over. Like, sometimes something that, like, I really like with one person, like, won't be there with the second, and, like, that might create some weird dynamics. But generally speaking, it doesn't affect like the baseline reason why I'm with each of these people at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find it so interesting. I think when I became a mom was when I started to, even though I only have one child, I started to understand polyamory more. So for me, that concept has always been very tricky because I always had that I guess ignorance maybe to how you have three people or more. I don't know if more is also typical or if like three is kind of the standard, but you have multiple people. It seems like it could get very confusing very fast. So for people that maybe aren't up to speed with like a traditional, I say traditional polyamory relationship, are all three people in a relationship together, or is it like you can be in a relationship with one other person, and your partner can also be in a relationship with another separate person, and those two people don't necessarily have to meet or be in the middle?
I'm actually not sure what the most common, based on my networks, most of whom are poly, that seems to be the most common configuration. People still tend to like pair bonding really hard in polyamory. So often you'll see like life partners together and then like both of them have girlfriends or boyfriends. And then like those boyfriends might have their own life partners or something. And so you get like sort of this chain of people. I also wanted to make one distinction, which uh, is very important for a lot of conversations about polyamory, is that there's a difference between engaging in polyamory versus like allowing your partner to do so. Like, for example, I am not really dating anybody right now, but I still consider myself polyamorous in a similar way that you might be gay even if you are single. And so I think like the thing that really defines this is whether or not you allow your partner to have other relationships. It doesn't necessarily mean that you personally have to be in other relationships, only that this is always like an open thing. Like you could always have this discussion or have the expectation that your partner is allowed to have these sort of experiences. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be. Like two people who are in a relationship with only themselves and not anybody else are still people that I could consider polyamorous because they might be in a situation where like they could like atoms like connect, like latch on to the to one's outside. People often call polyamorous groups polycules because they're all like these diagrams of connection. Anyway, I just wanted to make that distinction because a lot of people will be like, well, I don't want to be polyamorous because I only love one person. Like I meet the person I fall in love with and I'm just not interested in anybody else. I'm like, sure, that's fucking great. Go for it. That's not the question though. Like the question is like, are you preventing your partner from getting his needs met in places where you can't? And that's the big one for me.
I think that's the interesting thing too when it comes to traditional monogamous relationships is that we expect our partner to fulfill all of our needs and they're only one person, and then that dynamic gets more complicated as you become parents and as you become older and you have to start taking care of maybe sick grandparents and just get stretched so thin, but yet you're supposed to be all these things to one person when you often aren't enough things for yourself. So it makes sense that either occasionally or for like the life of the relationship that you would need something to supplement. Not, I know that's not like the best word because it kind of goes back into people's ego of saying like I'm not enough, but you kind of aren't. You kind of can't be all things at one time to everybody, right? And that doesn't mean that you're lesser or unworthy or that you're loved any less. It's just not feasible. Like we don't expect our friends to be everything to us. They can't be. That would be a toxic friendship, right? You would be like that, Candace is being very needy. I can't believe she's texting me at midnight and she expects me to come pick her up at the doctor's office and also cook her dinner and also surprise her. Like we don't expect that anywhere else. So I find that always very fascinating as well because we take it so personally.
Yeah, and this is one feature in which polyamorous relationships feel a lot healthier to me, is that you don't have that pressure on yourself to be so much more. Like often in monogamous relationships, people feel sort of this obligation to hit all of these things. But in poly, you get to put boundaries way more clearly. You can be like, hey, I don't want to do this thing. If you want to do this thing, you go find somebody else to do it with. Also, sexually, like people have run into so many problems when they're sexually incompatible or when one partner has a higher sex drive than the other. And it's like, what do you do? Like it doesn't make sense to try and force two people into the same mold. And so it's been a huge load off of me, like during times where maybe I'm on like birth control and my sex drive is really low, that like my partner like really wants a lot of sex, and then I get to be like, no, it's so good. I could be like, you know what, you finding sex is your job. You can go find somebody else to have sex with because I don't want to right now. Whereas if I were in a monogamous relationship, there would always be this little thing in my mind where like, well, I need to keep him happy because I'm not letting him get this from anybody else. So there's a lot more self-freedom. There's a lot more ability to fully explore what you actually want in a relationship and be a little bit more selfish about it, really, in ways that like end up helping everybody.